So the recording has begun, and today I'm really looking forward to what we're about to plunge into. We've just spent some time reading Leibniz over several weeks in his discourses on metaphysics. We've read afterwards a very lawful follow-up with Plato's Phaedo, which Leibniz cites as essential to understand his metaphysics, his conception of the monadology, his conception of the soul, and he makes the point Plato's Phaedo is the condensation of everything good that animates his creativity and his discoveries in science. So we did that last week. We finished that up. Jury did a wonderful job leading that. And this week, it's very lawful and fun that we're going to plunge into a contemporary of Plato and Socrates, who lived on the other end of the world island, as Quan polemicized in his previous class. So Quan, introduce us to Mencius.
Okay, so I would like everyone to go on the document and to go at the end of to map 4. If everyone got the Mencius document, okay, go to the end of the document. Okay. At the end completely. Because it's 185 pages more or less. Oh no, that's a okay. Go to map 4. That's one is map 6. Okay. So you see at the right side of the map, you have the Shandong Peninsula with the Lu Chi Wei Song Cai. Do everyone see that part of the map?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I would like to remind that Confucius was born in 551 and died in 479 in the principality called Lu, L-U on the map, just south of the bigger principality of Qi. It's written Q-I, but it's pronounced as if it's written T-C-H-I, Qi. So on the Lu, you have a smaller principality called Zhou, Z-O-U. Okay, so Zhou is the principality where Mencius was born, and by tradition, he was considered to be born in 370 BCE, and he died in 289 BCE. According to modern research, it's more 385 BCE to 302 BCE. But it's a man of the 4th century BCE. He lived and worked and died 24 centuries ago. As was the scion of the royal house of Shangying, Monk Ke, as his name in Chinese is, or Mencius in the Latinized form, was a scion of the Zhou royal house. And the Zhou royal house ruled China from 1046 BCE to 256 BCE. But they truly ruled only for the first 3 centuries. From 70 BCE to the foundation of the empire on 221 BCE by the first emperor of China, the Zhou royal house did not truly rule China, but was only the symbolic authoritative figure. And each prince or each duke or each sovereign were perfectly independent in his own principality. Monk Ke had a life quite resembling the life of Confucius in the sense that he was a scholar, he was a scion of a royal house, as many scholars of that time, and he was quite quiet in the first half of his life and only decided in around 320 BCE to start a political life. He started his political life as an advisor to the Qi principality on the map at the right, if you already see it, as the Jixia Academy, Jixia, J-I-X-I-A, and it was the Western Gate. Well, that Jixia Academy was at the Western Gate of Linzhi, and Linzhi was the capital city of the Principality of Qi. And Linzhi still exists nowadays, but its name is not Linzhi, but it's Zibo, Z-I-B-O. So if you go on Wikipedia and look at Zibo, you can see exactly the place where was the Jixia Academy, which was a place where Mencius developed many of his ideas. If you go on the map now and you go to the Principality of Wei, W-E-I, but not the small Wei, the big Wei just above the Han Principality, Mencius will have a quite important role for the prince of that Wei Principality. And when we will read the dialogues between Mencius and an important prince in this dialogues book, it will be about the king of Wei, or the king of Liang, which is another name for the capital of Wei. And the capital city of Wei, Liang, still exists today, and its name is not Liang, but Kaifeng, K-A-I-F-E-N-G. And once again, if you go on Wikipedia, you will be capable to see where exactly is Kaifeng. The important thing to maybe to remember for the discussion on the dialogue by Mencius is that Mencius is a fourth generation disciple of Confucius. Of course, he did not know Confucius directly, and he, according to tradition, he was the disciple of Confucius' only grandson, Zisi, Z-I-S-I, sorry. But he did not know Zisi directly, since Zisi died some years before Mencius' own birth. It's through a guy named Su Shao, which was at the fourth generation after Confucius, that Mencius had received the transmission from Zisi and from Confucius. Let's not forget that Zisi was the author of the book named Zhongyong, the Doctrine of the Mean. And in that Doctrine of the Mean, we have stated very clearly the four obligations of the gentleman. The first one being to cultivate yourself, the second one to put order your family, third one to assist the governance of the state, and the fourth one to bring peace to the world. So I would say that those four ideals of the gentleman has been transmitted from Confucius to Su Shao, and to Mencius, and to the present day. Let's not forget also that, okay, Ryan want me to repeat the filiation. Yep. Okay, it's easy. The filiation is from Confucius. After that is to his grandson Zisi, Z-I-S-I. After that is to a guy named Su Shao, S-H-I-S-H-O-U, and from Su Shao to Mencius, or Meng Ke, according to his name as pronounced in Putonghua. And the other thing that is important to remember is that...
Sorry, the son of Confucius, what's his name again?
The grandson, Zisi, Z-I-S-I. Okay, because son of Confucius was Po Yu, B-O-Y-U, but Po Yu did not play a very important role either in politics or in philosophy. So the transmission was from Confucius to his grandson, Zisi. And Zisi, yes, exactly. And Zisi was born in 481 BCE, 2 years before his grandfather's death, and he died around 401 BCE. So the other thing that I want to mention on this short introduction is that Mencius is the Chinese philosopher stating very clearly that the ruler has the obligation to perform. If he doesn't perform at an acceptable level, the people has the right to overthrow him. And the image that Mencius used is that the ruler is like a boat and the people is like the water. The water would be capable to capsize the boat if the boat is not working well. Of course, the image of the boat working well is a metaphor for a good governance. So I want to stress again the two major things from the Chongyong, the doctrine of the mean, the four obligations of the gentleman: to cultivate oneself, to put order in your family, to assist the governance of the state, and to bring peace to the world, and the political theory of the ruler being a boat that can be capsized by the water, the people, if the boat is not performing adequately. And I wouldn't stop here because Professor Robert Eno's own introduction is quite remarkable. So I don't need to elaborate too much, unless you have questions.
No, I think that was pretty satisfying. Thank you. So you're recommending now that we go to the beginning and read Professor Eno's introduction?
Oh, yes. And I think that it would take us probably the 2 sessions to finish that introduction.
Okay.
And I would even suggest to read the preface, or to be exact, the name is not the preface, but the prefatory note on the translation.
Okay, sure.
And it's only 1 page. It's a little bit scholarly, but it's only 1 page. It's worth it.
Okay. So do we have any volunteers to start this off? My download bar.
All right, I get it. Yeah, I'll do it.
All right, Bob, go for it.
All right. Prefatory note on the translation. Okay. This translation is an expansion of teaching materials developed for college courses over a period of several decades. When I was teaching, I found it convenient to provide students with translations that fit the terminology and interpretations I would use in class. And of course, the expense of these materials to students was much less than the cost of books. In later years, I posted course materials online, reducing expense further. Online materials allowed open public access, and I received many messages indicating that the materials were being consulted, especially by teachers. A few years ago, I took the partial materials I had used for the Analects of Confucius and expanded them into a full annotated translation, which I labeled a teaching translation. I note this full translation will also be helpful in this way. No one translation is definitive, and scholars who have devoted more specialized study to Mencius than I have published excellent translations in book form, and I would recommend to anyone with a serious interest in the text. D.C. Lau's 1970 translation, available from Penguin Books, is superb, and I admire my late friend Irene Bloom's 2009 translation with Columbia University Press. I've consulted these translations throughout, though my interpretations sometimes differ, and I use somewhat different vocabulary. In addition, I have found the rather idiosyncratic 1963 translation by W.A.C.H. Dobson to add insights in a number of cases. Any translation of the Mencius is ultimately indebted to the Chinese commentarial tradition. The earliest commentary that exists for the text is the richly detailed work of Xiao Qi, and all scholars are reliant on Xiao for many identifications and explanations that no later writer could have supplied. Nevertheless, because no outside confirmation exists for many of Xiao's assertions, we need to bear in mind that despite being our earliest guide, Xiao was himself 4 countries removed from Mencius, 4 centuries removed from Mencius. And we cannot be sure in each case how reliable his information was. Xiao's commentary forms part of the most extensive traditional collection of philological comments. The Mengxi Shengyi corrected interpretations of the Mencius, compiled chiefly by Xiao Shun, a very different, largely philosophical commentarial approach, is represented by the Song Neo-Confucian Xu Shi, whose work I consulted in the helpful Shishu Duben 4 books reader. Okay, edition of Xiang Boqian, who himself provides many useful comments. And like all recent translators, I found the commentary and modern Chinese translation edition of Yang Boshun, Menqi Yishu, to be indispensable. A companion version to the teaching translation appears online as Mencius Translation Commentary Notes, which reflects more fully the interpretations that informed my research on the text and on Confucianism and early Chinese thought in general, and which deals with points of scholarly interest that would be less germane in a college classroom setting. Some of these larger issues are outlined in brief in entries of the glossary appended to this translation. So I guess this is the introduction. Do you want me to continue?
Quan, is there anything you would say, or should we just jump? Should Bob just go straight into the introduction?
Okay, I would like to come back to a certain thing. Okay, okay, I would like to name. Okay, let's not get to the first commenters. Chao Qi was a man living almost 2 millennia ago. Okay, let's say 19 centuries ago. So from him, we have a lot of people from the 17th, 18th century near us, but the main transmission has been done by Chu Si, and he was born in 1130 and he died in 1200, meaning he lived about 8 centuries ago. And that Chu Si is very important because he renewed the understanding of Confucianism as a school of epistemology, of deep understanding of the natural order, the universe, as reflected in the physical universe, but also as reflected in human relations and how the rulers should interact with the people. And the and that Chu Si is truly the one that we will focus later on, if needed, in the understanding of Mencius. So once again, the ancestor Confucius, 551 BCE to 479 BCE, his grandson Zisi, the intermediary Kong Shishao, and Mencius. It doesn't mean that between Mencius and Chu Si, which is almost 15 centuries, that there were no one capable to understand the epistemology of true natural order. But I would say that Chu Si was the other one after Mencius that was capable to articulate with such clarity the Confucian understanding. Let's not forget many distinguished scholars also from the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 AD, and from the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 AD. So I will stop here before going to the introduction.
I've got a question, Quan, before we go into the introduction.
Yes.
And don't answer me if you think that the introduction might actually tackle this. I think that it might. I was reading years ago a book that described how Mencius, just like Confucius earlier, had been himself trying to organize politically for the creation of a sort of philosopher king. And he made a lot of efforts in that direction with many of his co-students or people, co-philosophers. Is that true?
Exactly, because there is an absolute parallel between Confucius' life and Mencius' life. May I remind that Confucius has been exiled from the Lu Principality in 497 BCE, and he returned 13 years later in 484 BCE. And during that more than a decade exile, he tried to convince different princes corresponding to the map number 4 and 5 that we saw 15 minutes ago, to adopt a form of government based on universal principles, or let's say in good epistemology. And from 327 and 320 BCE, meaning almost 2 centuries later, Mencius will start again the same adventure, unhappily ending in political failure, like what happened to Confucius 2 centuries before. And you're right, I answer you anyway, but you will have more details in the introduction.
Okay, cool, thanks.
I have a question for Quan also. Perhaps I should wait till the end because it's not quite at that point. It concerns the influence of Buddhism, and what I can wait, but it's what I was reading something online that that more or less stated that Buddhism traveled through India to China and then on to Korea, and even before it got to Tibet, which was, I thought, very, very unusual. They came to Tibet from China, in other words, instead of going directly north over the Himalayas. And it was, I guess, during the 9th century, during the Tang Dynasty, that the monasteries were closed and somewhat persecuted because I guess they were enriched, just like they did in 14th century France when the Templars were persecuted. But perhaps aside from that, do you, Quan, believe that Confucianism and Taoism would have survived if Buddhism wasn't suppressed?
Oh yes, because Buddhism, even nowadays, is considered a foreign religion, even if Buddhism exists in China for the last 2,000 years. But the original intellectual tradition, the original Chinese intellectual tradition is Confucianism. And I would like to add that Confucianism is the name that the Western universities gave to the original intellectual tradition of China. But the Chinese name is not Confucianism, obviously, it's Ru Jia. Ru Jia means the school of the scholars. Oh. And a note for the word Dao. Okay, Dao is a Chinese word meaning the way. In ancient times, each philosophical school in China was called the way. Okay, even the Confucius school, the Ru Jia, was called Ru Dao, meaning the way of the scholars, or Jia is a name, or is a word meaning family, or a family of philosophers. So Ru Jia, the family of scholars, or the school of scholars. So what it understood now in the West in the 19th century as Taoism was one way among many others, and not the idea of Taoism as understood nowadays. And Buddhism was suppressed in the 9th century by the Tang Emperor Guzong because of fiscal abuses and because of the abbots of the monastery were acting like landlords and not like spiritual teachers. So there were a short period, almost a decade, where Buddhism has been suppressed politically, it's true, but except for that period, Buddhism has always been quite welcome in China as another spiritual teaching. If we, on the basis of the Chinese own tradition, meaning the school of the scholar and the school of Taoism. And Taoism is very complex because you have what I call superstitious Taoism, which is a degenerate form of the understanding of the original Taoist or Taoist, because D in Pinyin is pronounced like a T, and the true exploration of the nature of reality as has been done by the true Taoist masters, and it has been much incorporated in the metaphysical principles of the school of the scholars, or what we call of the Confucianists in the West.
And if I could follow up, Quan, in Tibet, what was there before Buddhism actually reached there? So what didn't reach there till too much later? Did Taoism actually go, or was it just some kind of animistic religion?
The Tibetan people had their own religion. They call Bon, B-O diaresis N, Bon, and that Bon religion is a religion that we can qualify as animistic because they believe in the spirits, in the souls, and so on. So I don't want to make too easy rapprochement, but would say that that Bon religion can be compared to the Japanese original religion, the Shintoism, which is also an animistic religion.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Quan.
No problem.
Do we want to rotate the reading every, I don't know, 10, 12 pages or so to give people a chance? What do you think, Quan?
Sure. Absolutely. I suggest that since it's divided in pages, why not read about 2-3 pages each one, and after that we rotate? What do you think?
Wonderful.
Okay, I can continue. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
All right. Introduction. The Mencius in Chinese, Menci, I guess, may be the classical Chinese philosophical text that most profoundly influenced traditional Chinese culture. Although never granted quite the explicit homage that was given to the Analects among Confucian works, nor perhaps as admired as the two great Taoist texts, the Tao Te Ching and Shuangxi. The ideas and arguments in the Mencius have a clarity and literary power that gave them extraordinary impact over time. Although the full force of that impact did not reveal itself until the late Tang and Song dynasties, over a millennium after Mencius's death, ultimately the Mencius became a central canonical source for the animating ideas of the Neo-Confucian movement, which in its several forms dominated Chinese intellectual life from the 13th century through the 19th and survives today in the form of New Confucianism, a growing influence in the People's Republic of China and the Chinese diaspora. Mencius's life. The name Mencius, like the name Confucius, is a Latinized version of a Chinese name. Mencius' real name was Menke. He is referred to by this name only once in the Mencius. Mencius' disciples referred to him as Master Meng, which in Chinese was Mengshi, turned into Mencius by European interpreters of Chinese culture 2,000 years after his death. We do not know Mencius's dates with accuracy, but we do know that he was an old man at the time of his greatest life crisis in 1314, and we estimate his lifetime as falling in the period 380 to 300. Throughout this translation, all dates, unless otherwise specified, are BCE. For about the first 60 years of his life, Mencius seems to have lived quietly, becoming among the most renowned Confucian teachers of his age. Then, sometime before 320, he decided that the time was ripe to renew Confucius's active effort to persuade the rulers of the increasingly violent warring states era, about 453 to 221. How is that? Excuse me. How is that? Because it's warring states era was prior to, it's not BCE then?
Yes, it's BCE. It's BC. It's 453 CE.
453, and then the number goes down to 221. I don't understand why it goes back.
No, it goes down. It's BCE.
So
it's further away from Jesus. It's further away from Jesus, and then it's closer to Jesus.
Yeah.
BCE is okay. It's like BC, okay, as opposed to okay.
Yeah,
they changed it. AD, as I knew it, is now CE. Is that it?
Yes, because BCE means exactly before the Common Era. Okay.
Okay. All right. I get you, Quan. Sorry about that, but it gets confusing in this mind that was from a former epic, to accepted Confucian Tao and reform the world like Confucius, he began wandering from state to state, trying to find a ruler who would employ him and implement Confucian governance. About 314, he finally secured an appointment as a high advisor to the king of Qi.
Yes, exactly, of Qi.
Okay, a strong state that occupied territory northeast of Confucius's homeland of Lu, and Mencius's own home, the small state of Zhao. Thank you. But to his dismay, soon after the king showed the strong apparent interest in Confucianism, Qi launched a war to conquer another major state just to the north, Yan. Prior to launching the war, it seemed that the king lured Mencius into appearing to approve his aggressive attack. And Mencius apparently concluded that his appointment was actually no more than a public relations ploy on the part of Qi to justify its power play in Yan by claiming the endorsement of the most famous Confucian sage of the time. He resigned his position in despair and retired to his home, where he lived the rest of his life as a teacher. These events are narrated in the Mencius, mostly in a single series of passages. Although there are gaps in our chronology of Mencius's biography, there is no figure in classical China about whom we know more and whom we know so intimately. Although we have a sense of the characters of many people in China's classical era, and in some cases tales about them that include colorful detail, many of these accounts were formulated decades or centuries after their lifetimes, and many of, or most cases, have the troublesome defect of being obviously fictional, often building dramatic episodes around a few core features associated with the historical person. But the Mencius is not only rich in detail, both the pattern of event and, more important, the consistent nature of Mencius's speech and behavior make it very difficult to doubt that on the whole, we see here a portrait drawn from life of those who knew him well. Mencius's personality is a dominant factor in the Mencius, and the book shows us a brilliant, volatile, charismatic, irritating, self-righteous man whose intellectual insights can be so keen that his influence is still felt in China today, and whose self-justifying rationalizations can be so intellectually facile as to undermine the integrity of the central philosophy. The contradictions in his persons and lapses in his conduct signal that his textual persona was not an invention of others. We seem to be meeting a real man, real enough that some readers may occasionally feel they would rather have met someone else. Nevertheless, we have to recall the text most likely reached its current state only after Mencius's death, and because it was clearly recorded and assembled by Mencius's followers, we can assume that historical accuracy often took second place to partisan motives, and that both the memories of those writing and their writings to embellish, censor, or invent historical speeches and actions would be guided by the doctrinal purposes of the record they were creating.
Is there anything, Quan, that you would like to say about that, or should we just push through? It seemed like he was passing some judgments of his own opinion, but I guess we should see if that's legit as we read more Mencius.
Yes, it's very legit, because I take it on the contrary as a tribute to the quality of the text. Because, and let's not forget that the character of self-righteousness, we would find the same thing in the Analects by Confucius. Okay, let's not forget that if you read in detail the Analects by Confucius, you will find many judgments on political men, on aristocrats, on rich merchants of the time. So let's not forget that Confucius and Mencius were trying to reform the society, and most of the contemporaries perceived them as a preaching person and quite not necessarily pleasant to talk with. And I think it's a tribute, on the contrary, to those two men.
And I have a question also for you, Quan, again. Mencius was from the north, as I understand it. I'm not sure exactly where Confucius was from, but I think it was further south.
No.
At this time,
forgive me to interrupt you. If you look at the map, the Principality of Lu is about 50 kilometers north of the small Principality of Zhou. So they live in the same area.
Oh, it was the same area. Okay. So
okay.
What I was getting to was that Confucius must have written in it's something that's difficult for somebody speaking another language to understand. But the characters, even if you speak another dialect, represent the same thing. Am I correct, or am I mistaken?
No, you're not mistaken. I would like to remind some very basic things, okay? At the time of Confucius, and I remind that he was born in 551 BCE and he died in 479 BCE. And Mencius, let's take the numbers by Professor Eno, 384 BCE to 300 BCE, okay? At that time, you have two kinds of languages. You have the refined language of the court called Ya Yu. Ya Yu means exactly refined language. And that refined language was part of the education of the gentleman. And that refined language is the same language in the east, the south, the north, or the west of China. And that Ya Yu was coming from the way to pronounce Chinese characters of the royal court of the Zhou dynasty. The local people, peasant, they were speaking dialect, and those dialects were not written. Only the Ya Yu, the refined language, was written. A comparison that I can give for China today is that you have the Putonghua, which is the national language, and that national language is written, obviously, and it's written since the last 33 centuries, sorry. However, you have about 320 dialects in China, and some of those dialects are spoken by maybe 200,000 people, and some of the dialects, like Cantonese, are spoken by 120 million people, right? So it was the same thing at the time of Confucius. The aristocrat and the scholars, they can communicate with each other thanks to the written language and thanks to what I call Ya Yu, the refined language coming from the Zhou royal court. a little bit like Latin was the common language for European scholars in the Middle Age and during the Renaissance time.
Okay, another question follow up here, Quan. The other thing that I'm thinking of is, and this could be completely wrong, but my understanding is that even a different language like Japanese can understand the Chinese. It's the same script. Am I
No.
wrong?
Well, you're right for the written language, but you're wrong for the spoken language. In terms
No,
of
no,
spoken,
I mean the written language, yeah.
Okay. The spoken language is completely different. There's no commonality between Chinese and Japanese. However, when the Japanese met the Chinese for the first time in the 2nd or 3rd century AD, they didn't know how to write, so they used the Chinese characters to write. And even nowadays, they kept about 2,000 Chinese characters that they call kanji. Okay, you know that the Japanese language is written by a combination of about 2,000 characters from China, they call kanji, and a mix of hiragana and katakana.
Oh, interesting.
We want to have a switch up of the reading.
Should I continue?
Well, go for one more section, then we'll
Okay.
we'll switch it up.
I'm just going to intervene quickly. Quan, you said, okay, so you said the Japanese, to establish the language, they used 2,000 characters from the Chinese script, as well as 2 other things you mentioned, something
Yes.
katakana and
Katakana and hiragana. And it's a system to produce the sound of their own language and the sound of foreign language.
and the katakana is the first, and the second one is
Hiragana.
Okay.
And where did they get them from?
They invented themselves. The Japanese, when the Japanese man adopted the Chinese script in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, the Japanese women were not accepted in school. So the Japanese women around year 1000 invented the script hiragana and katakana to reproduce the sound of Japanese language.
Nice.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob.
All right. Mencius's World of History. The Mencius is very much a text of its time. It was written for an audience with a shared understanding of history and culture, and to read it profitably now, there are certain features of the worldview of its original readers that need to be clear. The period when Mencius lived was part of what is now known as the Warring States era. As its name implies, an era of endemic war between powerful regional polities in the area we now call China. For Mencius and his contemporaries, the period was seen not only as a chaotic time filled with violence and misery, but as a lapse from an earlier period of peace and unity, presided over by a single strong ruling house, the Shu dynasty.
The Zhou dynasty.
Zhou dynasty, thank you. The goal of Mencius and others like him was finding a way to a future that restored the peace and unity of the past, and most of Mencius's theoretical philosophical positions were taken in the services of that pragmatic goal. So we understand Mencius. It's important to So to understand Mencius, it's important to understand the restorationist goal that he was looking back towards, the image of the ideal past. That image was in part based on myth and imagination, but a substantial component was grounded in real events. In historical terms, the actual basis of Mencius's belief in an era of the past order was the early Zhou dynasty state. The Zhou dynasty order. The Zhou dynasty was understood to be the third in a series of long-lived dynasties, ruling over a single empire which occupied a more or less constant territorial space, at least conceptually. The three dynasties were called the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhao. While the historical status of the Xia is unclear, we know for certain that a large region of that is today northern and central China, was governed by the Shang royal house. The boundaries of the area it controlled shifted over time, and the nature of Shang control seems to have been relatively loose. But we know that the Shang royal house consolidated its power in the 16th century under a ruling king known as Tang. And it sustained a ruling line whose effective power waxed and waned over the centuries until its collapse in 1045 BCE. The armies that, I guess, excuse me if I could stop there for a moment. The king known as Tang, this is not the Tang dynasty you were talking about?
No. The Tang dynasty would be much later.
Yeah, it was like the 9th century. This is okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. The armies that conquered the Shang belonged to the leader of a border people called the Zhao, who lived in the far west of the region of Shang influence. The Zhao people had migrated and became part of the Shang polity only a few generations early. If the people near the center of the Shang state viewed themselves as civilized, the Zhao were probably viewed as barbarians. However, in 1099, an exceptionally charismatic man had become the leader of the Zhao tribe and had embarked on a program to reform his people and emulate Shang culture. He is known posthumously as King Wen, or the Cultured King. Shortly after King Wen's death in 1050, his son led the campaign and overthrew the last Shang ruler. From historical accounts written by the Zhao, picture as a bestial tyrant. The son was known as King Wu, or the martial king. Having conquered the Shang, King Wu laid claim to all the territory formerly controlled by the former dynasty. While we do not have a clear idea of what the form of the Shang polity actually was, we do know it was not the type of strong, centralized entity we think of as a territorial state. It seems more closely to have resembled a confederacy of groups that traditionally acknowledge the Shang as its dominant member. The Zhao founders, having proved the ultimate weakness of this arrangement, set about to build a different kind of structure that would consolidate their power. Members of the royal clan and its close supporters were granted authority by the king to establish garrison control of those regions of the former Shang domains and were distant from the royal capital of Songchu, the Chao homeland in the far west near modern Xi'an.
Yes. Here, I would like to interrupt you.
Please.
It was in the far west at that time, but Xi'an nowadays, if you look at the map of China, Xi'an is exactly at the geographical center of China nowadays.
Yeah. Xi'an is where the army of I don't know. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, the Terracotta army of the first emperor, who has been done 22 centuries ago, and it has been discovered in 1973 or 1974.
Just an enormous number. Amazing. Okay. Although territorial leaders allied with the conquering armies of the Zhao were allowed to retain local control as subjects of the Zhao, large regional districts in central and eastern China came under the military dominance of the new governing authorities, designated by the Zhao to rule over those regions on a hereditary basis as extensions of the royal aristocracy. Some of the major states of Mencius's day, such as the state of Qi, where Mencius's career reached its peak, began as such garrisoned outposts. In addition, the Zhao established a second capital in central China, Chengzhou, near Luoyang, which permitted armies under direct control to extend their reach and keep order. This system, often misnamed the Zhao feudalism, it has little in common with European feudalism, proved more effective in consolidating power than Shang political structures. While we know from written records at the last 2 centuries of the Shang that part of the king's ordinary role was to wage domestic wars against rebellious groups within the empire, during the initial centuries of the Zhao rule, inscriptional records suggest that when the Zhao armies fought, it was generally in wars of expansion, and that the Zhao Empire was in general a vast zone of relative peace under strong centralized power. In the era of greatness, from the mid-11th to the mid-9th century, the Zhao state was probably the largest and most peaceful empire the world had ever seen. Okay.
Here I would like to interrupt you.
Go ahead, please.
In general, the first empire of China is identified as the one founded in 221 BCE by Qin Shi Huang. And here I'm happy that Professor Eno talked of the Zhao polity as the largest and most peaceful empire the world has then ever seen 3,000 years ago. So in reality, the first Chinese empire was founded in 221 BCE, but it has been founded in 1046 BCE, and the area of that empire reached about 1 million square kilometers, which is about 10% of the present-day Chinese area.
And 10%, it was that was surrounded by the city of Xi'an, or was it, where was the center, Quan?
So the center, if it was around the we call nowadays Xi'an, but at the time it was not called Xi'an, it was called Dongzhou. Okay, so it was in the west, at the center of China. If you look at a map, present day China, Xi'an is exactly at the geographical center of China, even if 3,000 years ago, it was at the western border of China, because China was smaller 3,000 years ago than nowadays, obviously, since the Zhou Empire was only 10% of present day China area.
Okay. Okay, because of their accomplishments, both King Wen and King Wu were honored, and later generations as wages whose wisdom shaped the Zhou era of peace. However, although King Wu had founded this state, he did not live to see its full formation. He died suddenly in 1043, only 2 years after the conquest, at a time with his son and heir was a boy who too young to rule. Fortunately for Zhao, King Wu's younger brother, a man remembered as the Duke of Zhao, stepped in to act as regent for the young king. Initially, this act was perceived as a power grab by some of King Wu's other brothers, who had been sent out to govern from garrisoned strongholds in the east. These brothers attacked the armies of the Duke of Zhao in a civil war that lasted 3 years and almost split the new state. In the end, the Duke prevailed, and in 1035, he fulfilled the pledge with which he had first taken power and passed the state intact to his nephew, who had come of age, withdrawing himself from the capital and the political stage, and the act with few analogs in history. Because the detailed design and implementation of the new Zhao state was actually accomplished under the Duke of Zhao's regency, later generations granted him a full share of the credit for the state's success, and he was viewed as the third founding sage, beside his father, King Wen, and brother, King Wu.
All right, to continue the story.
Okay.
Do you have any other volunteers for reading?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Sound good?
Good.
Salut, Pascal.
Salut, Quan. Okay. The order lost. From the mid-9th century, the Zhao state fell prey to both internal and external pressures, and in the year 771, the era of consolidated Zhao rule came to an end. Raiders from the steppe north of the Zhao homeland penetrated the defenses of Zhongzhou.
Yes, Zhongzhou.
Zhongzhou. The capital was sacked, the king killed, and the heir of the to the Zhao throne was carried to safety by members of the Zhao aristocracy, who placed them in a secondary capital, Changzhou, which the Duke of Zhao had established as an eastern military base for elements of the royal army centuries earlier. After that time, the Chao kings were effectively the puppets of the landed aristocracy. The descendants of those branches of the royal aristocracy and its close allies who had been granted the rights to hereditary governance of districts under the early Chao became de facto rulers in their own rights. In their own right, sorry. Although the Chao royal house continued until 256 to rule in name over all the territories of the old empire, in fact, its only real power was exercised over a tiny kingdom around the eastern capital. From 771 to 221, sorry. No ruler governed more than a fraction of the old Chao territorial state, the large polity ancestral to what we mean today by China. The era was, in fact, The era was, in fact, a 550-year-long period of increasingly intense civil war among a changing cast of combatant polities, during which heirs to the powerful lords granted the means by
Yes, domains. Yes.
by the old Chao kings battled to extend their domains and succeed to the actual power of the old Chao Empire. Because during the era of disunity, the powerless Chao king dwelt in the old Eastern Chao capital, we call that era the Eastern Chao, and often extend its date a few decades past the actual end of the Chao royal house to 221, the year in which the state of King
Qin,
Qin,
like China, because China comes from Qin precisely.
Okay, so the year in which the state of Qin completed its reunification of China. By contrast, the era of Chao unity is called the Western Chao. The Eastern Chao era of 771 to 221 is itself divided in two by historians. The early portion is called the Spring and Autumn period, named after a court record, the Spring and Autumn Annals, which chronicles the years 722 to 481. The latter portion is called the Warring States period, also after a text, the Zhangguo Ce, or Intrigues of the Warring States. The division between these two eras is somewhat arbitrary. In this translation, I use the dissolution of the powerful Spring and Autumn era state of Jin or Yin?
Yes, Jin.
In 453 as the dividing point. Thus, the chronology of the entire Chao era is as follows, as you can see below. Although the year of division between the two Eastern Chao eras is a matter of convention, the differences between the periods as a whole are real and significant. During the Spring and Autumn era, there was a continually shifting balance of power. There were literally hundreds of de facto independent states of varying size, the inheritors of Chao land grants, traditional territories of Chao allies, and small statelets that were able to act with autonomy due to the chaotic political environment. Warfare during the spring and autumn period was largely a clash of small or moderate-sized chariot-led armies, with members of the hereditary aristocracy serving as chief combatants, matching their elite skills in chariot-based archery and swordsmanship, supported by small conscript contingents that ran beside their chariots. It was an era of constant bloodshed, but blood flowed in a trickle compared to the era of the warring states. After 500, chariot warfare gave way to infantry and, occasionally, cavalry warfare. The development of iron technology allowed for a proliferation of metal weaponry among mass conscript infantries, vastly increasing the lethality of combat. The art of war was no longer the personal mastery of charioteering and archery. It lay in an understanding of strategy and tactics, the deployment of and provisioning of huge armies, the arts of siege, warfare, and ruthless diplomacy that could forge momentary alliances among enemies to crush a common foe. The loss of life in war was on a scale not seen again until modern times, and the talents in demand by rulers whose power depended on military success to survive were technocratic rather than aristocratic. It just reminded me, when is The Art of the War by Sun Tzu?
Yes, exactly.
That's the warring state period, right?
At the end of spring and autumn, because Sun Tzu was helping king of Wu, He Lu of Wu, in 495 BCE to conquer the state of Chu. And your comment is very interesting, because Sun Tzu was, I would say, the last gentleman or the first technocrat among the gentlemen, because Sun Tzu was an aristocrat from the Principality of Qi, precisely the same principality where you have the Jixia Academy, but I would say he was the first technocrat and the own gentleman. And it was the end of the spring and autumn, a little bit before Confucius. Well, a little bit is not true, because Confucius died in 479 BCE, and Sun Tzu was helping He Lu of Wu to conquer Chu in 495 BCE. So it was 16 years before Confucius' death.
Okay.
I got a quick question. When the author here is describing the this period of bloodshed that had a value on technocrats over aristocrats, the word technocrats today means, I'm sure, something a bit different from what was going on back then. Could you describe what was a technocrat of the 4th century BC or 5th century BC? What does that mean?
Yes, a technocrat is someone capable to give you practical advices that will make you win in war, meaning how to dispose of the infantry, how to create on an industrial basis the weapons, how to bring food at the right moment and at the right time. Okay, so I would say that there is not much difference between the technocratic qualities of the time compared to the technocratic qualities nowadays. Okay, because the technocrats are people skillful in technical means in order to make you win, to gain more money or to gain more power, contrasted to the aristocratic qualities based on honor or on the desire to increase knowledge or creativity. Know my catchphrase, okay? I always am obsessed with the natural hierarchy of the philosopher king, of the aristocrat, meaning rulers motivated by creativity and knowledge, the timocrats, ruler motivated by honor, and the plutocrats, rulers motivated by profit. So I would say that the technocrats of the 4th century BCE or the 5th century BCE or the technocrats nowadays are quite the same people, because those are the people skillful in the art to make profits and to make power.
Quick question, Quan. Do the statues of Xi'an, the ceramic statues, do they date back to the Zhou dynasty?
No, they has been done at the end of the 3rd century BCE, because those terracotta statues have been made for the mausoleum of the 1st emperor of China, and the 1st emperor of China died in 210 BCE.
So you're saying that they're much older?
Excuse me?
Are they much older? Oh, you were talking about much older?
No.
That's what I'm understanding.
No. Those have been done for the mausoleum of the 1st emperor of China, who died in 210 BCE. And we're talking of before the founding of the empire in 221 BE. We're talking of the warring state period from 453 BCE to the foundation of the empire in 221 BCE.
210 BCE around then. Okay, so Xi'an had remained a capital at that time, or some important.
No. Well, no, Xi'an. Well, here I have to take 2 minutes to make some clarification.
Okay.
The name of the capital of the Zhou dynasty, Zhongzhou, Zhou was in the area of Xi'an, but it's not exactly Xi'an. And it was the capital of the Zhou dynasty between 1046 BCE to 770 BCE, okay? And they moved to the east because they were weaker after 770 BCE. Not to be confused with the imperial dynasty of the Han that will rule China much later, in between 206 BCE to 220 AD. Okay, it's not the same period, it's not the same people.
But it was still called Xi'an, the area.
No, Xi'an is a modern name that has been given under the Ming dynasty, and the Ming dynasty ruled between 1368 and 1644. So that name is much later.
Okay.
But it's in the same area. That's why it's so it's only to give a quick equivalent so the people can see it quickly on a map. That's all.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Pascal, you want to keep it going?
Yep. As these changes gradually evolved, especially during the 6th and 5th centuries, a social transformation took place. Power that had been monopolized by an hereditary elite came to be shared with a growing class of commoners whose intelligence and training equipped them with skills so valuable that rulers would compete to employ them at court in positions of increasingly higher prestige, overlooking their low birth. Over time, hereditary right and merit came to be competing criteria for social position, where hereditary right had once held sole sway. Those with hereditary claims who distinguished themselves in society came to be regarded as a distinct class of man, known as Shi,
True.
Shu. Okay. A term translated as gentleman here. Shu included men whose talents were in warfare, either as outstanding soldiers and battlefield leaders or as strategists, and also men who specialized in arts of statecraft, tax policy, agricultural technology, diplomacy, or social and political organization.
Excuse me, Pascal, to interrupt you. Okay, those three lines define perfectly what are technocratic qualities at the time of Confucius and Mencius.
Thank you.
Okay. The last group included the men we call philosophers in early China. Only a small number of the men we list as the great names in early Chinese thought were concerned with abstract matters of theory. Most were men whose advanced inquiries into human behavior, social institutions, and political organization were intended to be applied to the problem of restoring to China the unity, stability, and prosperity that was remembered as the lost promise of the Western Chao. The mythical past. But it was not only the Western Chao that these thinkers looked back to. The understanding of history during the Warring States era mixed documentary records and accurate facts with distorted traditions and outright myth. The Western Chao itself was idealized, and the broad practical features of the successful Chao monarchy were elaborated into detailed and often competing models of a finely articulated uniform state. These institutions were projected back into the Shang dynasty, which was re-envisioned as a preliminary version of the Chao system. And these were in turn used to reimagine the distant Xia dynasty.
Yes.
Which was not only viewed as an earlier version of the Shang, but whose historical narrative became a retelling of the Shang narrative, each dynasty proceeding from a sagely and virtuous founder to a bestial tyrant, justly overthrown. Beyond the three dynasties, the retrospective imagination of the Eastern Chao went further to create a pre-dynastic era of perfect sage rulers, famous characters borrowed from existing myths. Yao, the calendar maker; Shun, the perfectly loving son of a perfectly evil father; Yu, the Flood Tamer, who, in some accounts, was born a dragon from the body of his own father, a man whose failure to tame the same great flood had led to his death. These culture heroes were gradually imported into a type of prehistory, and the Warring States era people who narrated their tales built into the story of the origins of civilization the values of the Warring State, Shi class. Yao and Shun, in particular, are pictured inventing technocratic government, appointing specialists such as the inventor of agriculture, or the greatest of musicians, or Yu, the Flood Tamer himself to head bureaus of their courts. And both of those primal rulers were pictured honoring the meritocratic ideal of the Shu class by passing the throne on to a worthy man, Yao to Shun, Shun to Yu, rather than to his son and heir. The figure of Yu binds this mythical era to the history of the three dynasties. Yu is cast as both a sage earning the throne by merit and the father of a sage whose son's worthy succession to the throne enshrined Yu as the founding king of the Xia, the first of the three dynasties.
Pascal, sorry to interrupt you.
That's fine.
I would like, in order for everyone to understand the history of exemplars, which is the next paragraph, that I would like to go to the chronology, just the next page. Matthew, can you move to the exactly here? Here is the chronology. Okay. So here we have a chronology of exemplary rulers, sages, and tyrants. But my purpose is not to talk about the exemplaries. I rather want to use that chronology as a clear representation of the first 2,000 years of Chinese history, okay? On the left, where it's written legendary, okay? Archaeological discoveries nowadays call that period the Longshan culture, and the Longshan, Longshan, is about 5000 BCE to 2000 BCE. And before that, we have what we call the Yangshao culture, Yangsho, which is about 7,000, exactly. So it's a 7,000 BCE to 5 to 4,000 BCE. Okay, so we have the prehistory, the close prehistory, which is the Neolithic prehistory, Yangshao culture and Longshan culture, which correspond to legendary in that chronology. After that, we have the Xia era, about 2000 to 600 BCE. We have archaeological evidence of a state for those 4 centuries, but there were no written records. So we cannot be sure that they call themselves Xia, okay? Because the name Xia has been given to them by later historians. But there are archaeological evidence of a state during those 4 centuries. And the Shang dynasty from 1600 to 1045, which is the dynasty from which Confucius is a scion, is the first dynasty with written records, also with archaeological proof. And they are also called the Ying dynasty, Y-I-N. And why the Ying dynasty? It's because the last capital of that dynasty was called Ying. It's as simple as that. So it's called either the Shang dynasty, the Ying dynasty, or the Shang Ying dynasty. And Bob, if you look at the column under the Shang dynasty, it's written Tang, which is the name of the first king of that dynasty. And after that, you have the Zhou dynasty starting 1045 BCE and ending in 256 BCE. But here, the chronology ends with 453 BCE, which is the end of the Spring and Autumn era. And the Warring States era will start in 453 BCE and will end in 221 BCE, which is the foundation of the Chinese Empire by Qin Shi Huang. And I hope that it will help you to have an image, to get a representation of the first 2,000 years of Chinese history, plus 5,000 years before, which is the end of prehistory, formed by the Yangshao culture and the Longshan culture. And after that, we have the three royal dynasties, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. And in 221 BCE, the start of the Chinese Empire, ending in February 1919 and 12, meaning 21 centuries later. Sorry for the interruption, hoping that it would have you to have a clear representation of Chinese chronology.
No, it's very good, Quan, because I know even for me, the history of Eastern civilization is really, I'm not up to date for that. And it's not something that we see in our curriculum in school. So it's really mixed up in my mind when we read all these dates and name, and you know, like it's hard to figure out, but it's getting better. It's getting better. It's good. I like it.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yes.
cool.
Yeah, same as Pascal. For me, this is 101 Eastern Eastern history. Yeah.
And it's not even Eastern history, it's Chinese history only.
Yeah, yeah,
Chinese, sorry.
yeah, exactly. It's Chinese to me. All right. So, a history of exemplars. For Mencius, as for his contemporaries, this history was the factual foundation of human society and civilization, on which a realistic approach to the political crisis of the warring states era needed to be built. While conditions of the present times were not the same as those in the past alone provided positive and negative models of how society could be transformed and order restored. The positive exemplars from the mythical era were Yao, Shun, and Yu. In historical times, there was Tang, the first dynastic king of the Shang, and the three founders of the Chao Kings Wen and Wu, and the Duke of Chao. And there were negative exemplars as well. The last king of the Xia, named Ji, who is it Ji or Jie?
Jie.
Jie, who was clearly modeled on Chao, the last king of the Shang, as well as the kings judged most responsible for the decline of the Western Chao, King Li, and the final ruler of the unified empire, King Yo.
Yeah.
For warring states era thinkers like Mencius, one final group of exemplary rulers was also important. Over the centuries of the spring and autumn era, a small number of powerful regional rulers had arisen who were able to form grand alliances among many of the contending states, and who, explicitly posing as defenders of the powerless but legitimate Chao monarchs of the time, imposed a partial order on the states during the period of their reigns as lords. These men, 5 in number, but with 2 of the 5 variously named, were recalled as hegemons, the most famous being the initial 2. 7th century lords of the states of Qi and Jin. For thinkers like Mencius, these men were both debased imitators of the sage rulers and also positive models of practical accomplishment. Along with these ruling figures, an assortment of wise ministers appointed like the Shi on the basis of their virtue and accomplishments, as well as men who prove their virtue by resisting the temptation to serve tyrants, added to the pantheon of sage exemplars. The names of such men, among them Yi Yin, Bo Yi, Liu Xia, Wei, and above all Confucius, fill out the ethical vocabulary of history that we see in the Mencius. Mencius's views of human possibility are reasoned through these positive and negative exemplars. We are all capable of moral perfection because we are all people, just as Yao, Shen, and Yu were people, and they demonstrate the potential innate within each of us. We know that society can be perfected in our day because Kings Wen and Wu, together with the Duke of Chao, created a perfect society in theirs and demonstrated the potential of well-led people to enact a utopian order. Okay, somebody else wants to pick up.
I can do it. Are we at Confucianism? Mencius was a follower of Confucius, who had lived roughly 2 centuries earlier. Confucius's teachings were significant not only for their content, but because his followers used them to establish a distinct teaching tradition that blossomed into a well-defined intellectual school. Confucianism, apart from its ethical and political doctrines, emphasized the essential importance of mastering behavioral forms characteristic of the sages who had created civilization, forms we call ritual, but which were more central to Confucianism than that word may suggest. The Chinese term for these forms, li, denoted all those sanctioned forms of conduct that distinguished well-regulated civilized society from the barbarian conduct of nomadic and hunter-gatherer tribes that surrounded the states of the old Zhou Empire. These forms extended from everyday etiquette to ceremonials of political and religious practice. Confucians held that the heritage that sage culture heroes left behind them lay precisely in these forms. In their mastery lay the key to becoming a sage oneself and returning the world to the type of utopian order that had characterized the initial ages of the 3 dynasties and the primordial era of sagely rule. As Mencius puts it, if you wear the clothes of Yao, chant the words of Yao, and act the acts of Yao, you are simply Yao. Confucians regarded these forms as the key to the future restoration of order, the Tao of human fulfillment that had been traced by generations of sages and put into practice by dynastic founders. The ethical insights about constructive human relations and social leadership that later students of Chinese thought have seen as central to Confucianism were originally inextricably entwined with Confucianism's commitment to ritualism. Judging by its usage in early texts, the Chinese term for Confucians, Ru, probably denoted for contemporaries first and foremost a master of ritual form, and only secondarily a person committed to ethical doctrine. Although Confucius himself was famous for his valiant but unsuccessful political effort to persuade a ruler to adopt his Tao and bring order back to his state and the world, Confucius's disciples and later followers did not follow his example. They used their mastery of ritual to find positions as court ritualists or tutors, or to serve private families as ceremonial masters for weddings, funerals, and so forth. The greatest among them became, like Confucius, transmitters of the Tao. For them, the teachings of the sage rulers of the past, passing it on to the next generation of Ru, so that it would be preserved for a future time when society would welcome it once again. The Analects of Confucius, which first began to form as a text over this period, was explicit in warning Confucians not to risk the dangers of the cutthroat politics of the era by appearing at courts in times of chaos. Two of Confucius's senior disciples had lost their lives in that way. Not until Mencius, a century and a half after Confucius's death, do we see another Ru embark on a sustained effort to seek out a ruler who would implement the Tao by traveling from state to state, forming connections that would lead to an introduction at court with an opportunity to risk offering ethical policy advice to an impatient ruler engaged in high-stakes military contests, and to compete for favor and ministerial position openly with other courtiers and vested powers whose enmity could be lethal. To get a sense of the personal risk involved, see this section. By the time Mencius took on this role, the shape of both the intellectual and political worlds had changed dramatically from Confucius's day. Major challengers to Confucianism: Moism and Taoism. Moism. During the 5th century, there was a reaction against the doctrines of Confucius and the spreading school of ritualism he had consolidated. The most prominent anti-Confucian school was Moism, the followers of Mo Di, whose ideas are represented in the text Mo Zi. Moists share the Confucian project of finding a path back to the social and political order seen in the past, and they accepted some of the fundamental ethical values of Confucius, such as celebration of the value of humanity, Ren. But they interpreted their mission and these ethical concepts in an entirely different framework. The Moists seem to have been the first in China to discover the power of syllogistic reasoning, and they used it to argue for a strict utilitarian ethics, based not on the cultivation of sagely virtue through ritual practice, but on action and policy choices based solely on calculations of optimal impact on social welfare. The style of Moist thought was entirely new. Whereas Confucius had pronounced, Moists argued, and they used their new intellectual tools with such confidence that we repeatedly hear the voice of the Mo Zi telling us that it cannot understand how anyone can hear their reasoning and remain unpersuaded. Among the features of doctrine that Moist's reasoning formulated were a series of anti-Confucian positions attacking both the ideas and the real-world conduct of the Ru. For Moists, ritual was a simple waste of social resources and a distraction from the mission to rescue civilization from the chaos of centuries-long civil war. The Moists saw the immediate task as stopping war. Like the Confucians, they formed tight-knit communities of specialists to pursue their mission. Unlike Confucians, they specialized in the arts of war, particularly those arts that could defend a state under attack by an aggressor. And also, unlike Confucians, Moists were more than willing to risk their lives confronting the chaos of their day. Training in paramilitary groups, Moists would travel to courts to persuade aggressive rulers to adopt their pacifist policies or to offer their military services to rulers whose states had come under attack. Rejecting attachments to family and friends that lay at the core of Confucianism's personalistic ethics, Moists strove through efforts of disciplined will to overcome narrow sentiments in favor of a type of universal love, consistent with their utilitarian principles. Although Moism became a large forgotten school within 2 centuries, most likely because the reunification of China in 221 put an end to the kind of interstate warfare Moism was designed to combat, it is clear that Mencius regarded Moists as the most serious challenge to Confucians, and many passages in the Mencius are direct and indirect attacks on Moism. And it is equally clear that waging intellectual warfare against the Moists, Mencius adopted Moism's primary tool argument. Although the Mencius is not written in the form of sustained argumentative essays like the Mozi, as was the 3rd century Confucian work Shunzi, it may be the early text that argues most relentlessly. Indeed, in section 3b9, we see that Mencius was viewed as exceptionally disputatious by his contemporaries. Many passages in the Mencius involve frontal challenges to Mencius's ideas and personal conduct, which he counters with a broad array of aggressive debate tactics, drawing on logic, authority, and rhetoric. In fact, large portions of the Mencius can be read as a debate textbook for Confucian disciples.
I had never heard of Moism ever before this moment. Quan, do you concur with the professor's assessment, or would you say that there's something more nefarious behind Moism? Because it seems somewhat virtuous the way he described it.
Yes, I would say that those the Mohists were not oligarchical people. Okay, the Mohists truly wanted to help the people, but with a down-to-earth program, if you want. And you probably heard the name Mohis, Mozi as Mencius, because Mencius is the name given to one of the Chinese satellites that has been sent to the space in the Chinese equivalent of the GPS.
Okay.
And it's very interesting because it shows that how can I say that? Because of those 5 centuries of loss of authority of the Zhou royal house, many solutions have been proposed, but the true solution has always been on the rediscovery of universal principles and of the natural order of the universe and of the natural hierarchy between human beings according to their mind development. And that is the main line by the school of scholars, or Confucianism, as we say in the West.
And so that would be something which is lacking or absent in the Mohist worldview, is that higher, what you just pointed out?
Exactly. You understood exactly what I wanted to mean, in the sense that contrary to the pure oligarchical mindset of our school, like the legalist school, for example, the Mohists were closer to the people, but they were a little bit naive, thinking, if I go back to my axio-epistemo-political triangle, they were naive enough to think that they would succeed by stressing on the outer 3 corners of the triangle, meaning policies, modelization, and the economy and the military. In one word, the external organization, right? They don't take into account the educational aspect or the epistemological aspect, which are the 3 inner corners of the triangle, and especially to the center of the triangle, which is the axiological aspect or the ethical aspect, meaning the discovery of the universal order and how, by education and right epistemology, to get access to that level of awareness and of mind development. And I saw the comments by Ryan. If you go to my presentation called Plato and Confucius, Spiritual Brothers, you will see that I answer to your question by yes, because the Platonic epistemology and the Confucian epistemology is exactly the same, using different words because one was Greek and the other was Chinese, but they use practically the same steps, from the philosopher king to the aristocrat to the democrats to the lower democrats to the plutocrats to the democrats and to the autocrats. So those are the Greek words given by Plato. But if you read chapter 2, section 4 of the Analects by Confucius, you have the same steps, but with the words by Confucius.
Thank you.
All right, Ryan. Yeah, you got the link to Quan's class I just posted in the chat. So just save that, and then you can post Quan some more questions. Okay, that was useful. That was very useful. Okay, so I guess, do we have time for one more section, guys? What are we feeling?
It's quite a bit to digest, and I'm really enjoying.
Yeah,
But
Matthew.
Go ahead.
One.
Matthew, if we have another 15 to 20 minutes, I would like to make a small drill on Chinese chronology, because I think that's a minimum that we have to learn.
Sure.
Yeah, that would help. Yeah.
But Bob, I don't know if you had a question or comment, because I don't want to interrupt you. Bob,
Yes.
did you have a question or comment?
Well,
Because
I didn't have a question. What I'm thinking is that this is a lot to digest, and it's really good. But you have to, for us in particular, anybody that's a Westerner, it's going. All these terms are different, and just the pronunciation. I'm trying to absorb it, but I'll be interested. I think we've done enough of the reading, but your interpretation would certainly be welcome on any of this, and anybody that has any questions.
Well, how about
my
scroll down. I just Bob.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Sorry, I just wanted to just say I scrolled down just quickly here, and I saw that this whole section ends in a page. So how about we just finish this, and then Quan, you could.
All right.
We have Taoism and Yang Zhu, and then other schools, and then it ends on page 12.
Yeah, we can end the section. I agree.
Okay, Cynthia, you want to keep going?
Mm-hmm. Taoism and Yang Zhu.
Yeah, Yang Zhu. Yeah.
Yang Zhu. Taoism does not appear to have formed a school during the pre-Qin period, but the currents of thought that later came to be denoted as Taoism were certainly widespread. It was traditionally believed that the earliest of the great Taoist philosophers was Lao Tzu, author of the Tao Te Ching, who is said to have instructed Confucius. Most Western scholars now regard that tale as a legend, and Lao Tzu himself as a fictitious construct, the shadowy sole author of a text that was actually a composite from many anonymous hands. Its early components probably the products of the late 5th or 4th centuries, although, like Confucianism, Taoism built upon styles of thinking that may have been much older. When we speak of early Taoism, we usually mean principally two texts, the Tao Te Ching and the Chuangzi, the latter written by a figure scarcely less shadowy than Lao Tzu, Chuang Zhou. But there are other texts that seem close to Taoism in spirit, such as certain chapters that appear in larger anthologies, like the Almanac of Lui Shi, Chun Xiu, or the Guanzi. All of these texts seem to advocate retreat from engagement in society and a rejection of convention, hallmarks of the approach we call Taoist. But there are major differences among these texts. The Tao Te Ching focuses on attuning oneself to an inexorable cosmic order. The Tao, the Chuangzi, which is in fact a composite of several types of texts, focuses in its core on systematic skepticism regarding the possibility of ordinary knowledge of facts and values, and the promise of a variety of approaches to superior perspective that can provide certainty, or perhaps fulfillment in uncertainty. A set of Taoistic chapters in the Guangzi focuses on meditational techniques. Among the approaches associated with Taoism are ideas associated with the figure of Yang Zhu, a primary target of the Mencius. Yang Zhu was famous for maintaining that the only imperative for humans was self-preservation, sometimes pictured in a very concrete way as sustaining the undamaged form of the body. Virtually nothing is known about Yang Zhu. In the early 20th century, an eminent Chinese scholar proposed that Yang Zhu's name was actually a distortion of Zhuangzhou, and that Yang Zi and Zhuangzi were the same person. While this has never been a popular theory, half a century later, an equally eminent British scholar, A.C. Graham, demonstrated that certain chapters in the Almanac of Lui were almost certainly lost, Youngist texts, and some of these chapters are indeed duplicated in the Zhuangzi. When Mencius picks out Yang Zhu's egoistic ideas as a second explicit target beside the Moists, he's picking out a figure whom we may regard as marginal among thinkers who might be classified as Taoists. But no one in Mencius's day was called a Taoist, and there existed no identified school of which others might be more central than Yang Zhu. Youngist thought probably serves in the Mencius to represent the perceived selfishness of all who taught doctrines advocating social withdrawal and a quest for unity with some form of nature outside the human sphere. Other schools. Apart from the challenges of Moism and Taoism, a variety of other schools of thought proliferated in the interval between Confucius and Mencius. Of these, we see only one other in the Mencius, the School of Agriculturalists. This is somewhat puzzling because a substantial portion of the book takes place at the capital of the state of Qi, during a period when that city was the recognized center of what we call the 100 schools of philosophical thought, an intellectual correlate to centers such as Cordoba under the Umayyad Caliphate, or Paris after the founding of its great medieval university. By royal policy, Qi provided settled lodgings for masters and disciples associated with any number of other schools, including a range of naturalistic schools, early legalists and logicians and philosophers of language. A neighborhood near the city, Jixia Gate, was reserved for masters such as these who arrived in Qi seeking patronage. And although Mencius would have been naturally ranked among them, we see in the Mencius no recognition of this community, and only one instance of interaction with a famous master drawn from its ranks. One reason for this may be that these masters were recognized as assets to the state, but not to the court, where they held no rank and performed no functions. The mission at the center of the Mencius is not the philosophical one, for which Mencius is celebrated today. Despite the text's rich philosophical discourse, it is political, to transform the world.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And I would like to interject at once, okay? I'm very admirative of Professor Eno's introduction, but I would like to disagree with the last line, okay? it is political to transform the world. But here again, political in the strict sense of the word is the outside three corners. So you cannot have politics without philosophy. It's impossible, at least according to my understanding. You need to have the axiological dimension, the educational and epistemological dimension, and with those two combined together, shining outwards as the three outer corners of the axio-epistemopolitical triangle.
What's the axiological one? Do you mind elaborating on that?
Axiology is a synonym of ethics, okay? So what I mean by the triangle is that imagine a triangle. At the center, you have the axiological dimension, meaning the universal principles. And at the inner three corners of the triangle, you have the epistemological and educational aspect, meaning that you have to reach to the axiological level to get the developed mind and the level of awareness in order to be either a philosopher, an aristocrat, or a democrat, which according to Plato and Confucius are the minimum to be worthy to rule. And from that center, you shine out on the three outer corners of the triangle, meaning the military, the economy, the policies, and the modelization.
You just named 4 things, though.
Well, economy and military, it's on the same corner for me.
Ah, okay. Right.
As they say, la guerre n'est que la continuation de la politique, et la politique n'est que la continuation de la guerre.
Et tout une continuation de l'économie.
Exactly. What a pleasure to what a pleasure to speak to someone that I don't need to explain everything.
Cool. So, Quan, what you said that there was something regarding a timeline or a video or something like that that you wanted to end with. Is that still a thought?
Yes. Well, it's not a video. Okay, I would like to go back to page 8 of the introduction. Okay, where you have the chronology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I would like simply to repeat the first 2,000 years of Chinese chronology. Okay, but before that, I would like to repeat the name of 2 Neolithic cultures. Was very important in Chinese history because even if they didn't have any written artifacts, they were important because there was a continuous cultural path from those 2 Neolithic culture to Chinese history. So the first one is the Yangzhou culture, Y-A-N-G-Z-H-A-O, Yangzhou culture, from 5,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE. The second one was a Longshan culture, Longshan, from 3,000 BCE to 2,000 BCE. And after that, we go to the chronology on page 8, okay? So on the chronology on page 8, on the left, we start with legendary, okay? Legendary correspond to what in archaeology nowadays is called the Yangzhou culture, meaning 3,000 BCE to 2,000 BCE. And after that, we have the Xia era, 2000 to 600 BCE. And once again, we have archaeological proof for that dynasty, even if in that dynasty there is no written artifacts.
Sorry, just quick, could you restate the name of that one for me?
Xia era, Xia dynasty, XIA is written on the chronology.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Xia era or Xia dynasty from around 2000 BCE to 1600 BCE. So that dynasty has archaeological proofs, but with no written artifacts. The first dynasty with written artifacts are the following one: the Shang dynasty, also called the Ying dynasty, YAN, from 1600 BCE to 1045 BCE. And the third royal dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, ZHOU, began in 1045 BCE and ended in 256 BCE. But they truly ruled only the first 3 centuries, meaning more or less the first 3 centuries, between 1045 BCE to 771 BCE. And after that, we have the spring and autumn period and the warring state period, which were the 5 centuries of relative disorder, because you need to imagine that it was not always in a state of warfare. There have been periods of relative calm and peace during those 5 centuries, from 771 BCE to the foundation of the Chinese Empire in 221 BCE. And that's the 5 centuries which interest us in the discussion of Confucius and Mencius. And if there are things that you are not sure about the chronology, please ask the question and don't be shy.
Okay, I guess a simple question here. So the first emperor, which began in the Han Dynasty, and into which we have the Terracotta warriors that were created in his honor, there were no emperors before that. It was just kingdoms. It was kings in all time. Okay.
Exactly. The 3 dynasties called Xia, Shang, and Zhou. The supreme ruler of those organizations were called in Chinese Wang, and Wang is translated in English as king. The first emperor of China was not from the Han dynasty, it was from the Qin dynasty. It was a short-lived dynasty from 221 BCE to 206 BCE, but it was a meaningful dynasty because it started the Chinese Empire, which will last for 21 centuries. The Han dynasty is the dynasty that will follow the Qin dynasty, and it's a 400 years long dynasty from 206 BCE to 220 AD.
Secondary follow-up question. When I think of a dynasty, like, if you think about Egypt, it's one central power that exerts its influence across an entire domain without, anyway. In China's case, in these periods of the Shang and the Zhou and the spring and autumn, the warring state periods, was there like one authority, or were there many sort of separate sub-empires or subgroups fighting it out for hegemony within the domain?
The Shang dynasty was ruling a whole united domain. Okay, so between 1600 BCE to 1045 BCE, it was a central rule by the Shang king. Okay, that's 1. 2, at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, from 1045 BCE to 770 BCE, it was a centralized state. It was a unified polity. From 770 BCE to the founding of the empire in 221 BCE, the 5 centuries of disunion, because I prefer to say disunion than chaos, because it was not always war. It was a series of principalities, and the Zhou king had a moral and religious authority. And it was called the Eastern Zhou. Why the Eastern Zhou? Because contrary to the Western Zhou, who truly ruled from a centralized capital city. The Western Chou were only religious figure, and the political authority was with the local prince.
I got last question. I just feel like I could ask you anything. It's just like, uh, so India at this time during this period, I guess maybe that's because it's like a chemistry, right? Nothing can exist in isolation. There's always a chemistry operative as a whole. Were there is there a lot of evidence of the interactivity? I know during the Gupta period later on, there's obviously evidence of all sorts of overlap, but during this period, is India playing a significant role in terms of how it's overlapping or interacting with China, or vice versa, or is it relatively two separately evolving cultures during this time, as far as we know?
I would say that there were no significant interaction between India and China before Buddhism. Okay, and Buddhism, according to present day research, came to China around year 150 AD. Okay, so it's at the end of the Han Empire. Because the Han Empire ended in 220 AD. Okay, so let's say, for the sake of memory, that Buddhism first came into contact with China in 100 AD. Okay, so for the period that concerns us, from 2000 BCE to the foundation of the Chinese Empire in 221 BCE, we can say that there was no meaningful interaction between India and China, at least at the state level.
Okay. Anyone else? I feel like I was hogging Quan. Okay, Quan, I do have other questions, but I guess I'll save them for now and maybe throw them at you next week.
Well, if you have a last question.
All right, yeah, I got another question. Okay, so Japan during this period, when is Japan, I mean, obviously there's Chinese origins there. Is this in the legendary period that you have Japan being set up as a, I guess, a civilization, or what period is that growing in or beginning in?
Okay, Japan, you have two prehistorical period. Okay, one prehistorical period is called Jomon, Jomon, and Jomon started around 10,000 BCE to 300 BCE. That's the first prehistorical phase of Japan, if you want. The second prehistorical phase of Japan is called Yayoi. Yayoi is written Y-A-Y-O-I, Yayoi. And it began in 300 BCE and it ended in 300 AD. Okay, so China was already a world empire according to the criteria of that time, and Japan at the same period of the Han Dynasty Empire was a collection of tribes. And between 300 AD and let's say 500 AD, those prehistorical tribes began to organize themselves a little bit on confederations, if you want. Okay, and the first contact with the Chinese Empire happened somewhere in the 3rd century AD, around 280, and the Japanese and the Chinese historians kept records of this first contact and describe tribal societies ruled by a queen. Okay, And from that moment, Japan has been influenced by Chinese culture through the Koreans. And the Koreans will bring Buddhism to Japan. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was 580 AD or so, 580 AD. And so it was 3 centuries after the first contact of the Chinese merchant with Queen Himiko, Himiko. It was a kind of chieftain or a priestess that has a kind of over influence over all the tribes of Japan around the area of Kyoto nowadays and Nara, okay, the southwest of present-day Japan. And Japan began to imitate the Chinese writing and bureaucracy and organization with Prince Shotoku Taishi, okay, Shotoku, Shotoku, Taishi, Taishi, at the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 7th century, meaning corresponding to the Tang Empire. And the Tang Empire, I remind you the chronology, is 618 to 907.
Awesome.
Sorry, just to the first contact was in 200 AD between China and Japan.
Yeah, more or less. Okay, and Japan was a kind of tribal society at the time under the
queen,
under a priestess. Okay, it's more like a priestess called Himiko by the Chinese.
Would you take one more?
Yes, sure.
Okay. I know people are probably getting tired. Okay. I've seen pictures in a documentary, and I don't know if it was in the pyramid documentary that you had shared, but I've seen it in certainly other videos, aerial views of all sorts of pyramids in China. And I don't know much about that or when they were built. And they didn't say very much in those videos. They were just, I think it was the narrative was leading people into aliens were, doing everything. But I still found the visual images interesting. And I was wondering if you knew anything
too, Matt. I can't remember there was like a cave that was found that like it was flooded up until recently, and it's like crazy advanced technology that was able to carve this very massive structure in the inside.
Right. They called that, that was like the inverted pyramids in China that they just discovered. Yeah, and there's like a bunch that still need to be drained of water. So you have those massive, beautifully organized structures underground that are just geometrically just incredible engineering feats. And then you have these pyramids above ground. Do you know anything about that stuff?
Yes. Before answering your question about the pyramids, the Chinese pyramids, I want to mention one thing that for me is important. The Japanese imperial family is from Korean extraction. Okay, and it's not something fantastic. The Japanese aristocrat themselves recognize that the imperial family of Japan was originally from a family of Korean immigrants coming to Japan somewhere in the 3rd or 4th century AD. That being said, going back to your question on the Chinese pyramid, there's 2 answers. The first answer is easy. In the past, Chinese emperors would be buried in a subterranean mausoleum, and above that mausoleum, they would build an artificial pyramid covered by mountains and artificial mountains, and on which they would plant trees. Okay, so the first kind of Chinese pyramids are simply mausoleum of Chinese emperors. If you go to the province of Shanxi, for example, you will find plenty of those pyramids, mausoleum from the Tang Dynasty, for example. That's the first answer and the easy one. The second answer is more controversial. There are some pyramids in China which are not the mausoleum of emperors or empresses. Those pyramids are still under investigations, and the Chinese government doesn't reveal much of the results of the investigations.
That was not satisfying. Thank you. All right.
All right, stay tuned for the next episode.
Yeah. Good. This was good. Thank you for setting this up, Quan. I look forward to next week.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Quan.
Thank you,
Okay.
Quan.
Great. Thanks.
Bye-bye. See you
Bye,
next Wednesday.
everybody. Bye.
Yeah.